The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and expensive in the way only bitter people seem to enjoy. My mother-in-law had used real postage instead of a meter strip, like she wanted the insult to feel formal. My name was written in her slanted blue script, every letter pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. I opened it at my kitchen counter with one hand still wrapped around a mug of coffee, and by the time I reached the bottom of the second page, I was laughing so hard I had to set the mug down before I spilled it. Enclosed was an itemized bill for what Diane Mercer called the destruction of my son's future. She had broken it into neat categories. Loss of professional momentum due to emotional instability, $12,000. Repayment for family support extended during marital hardship, $8,400. Embarrassment and reputational damage to the Mercer family, not quantified, but minimum compensatory amount of $15,000. Therapy expenses for Owen after my abandonment, $3,200. The catered engagement dinner they had paid for 3 years earlier, apparently now refundable because I had failed to remain a grateful wife, $4,900. And at the bottom, below a line drawn with a ruler, she had written in bold, steady letters that I had 30 days to remit payment in full before she pursued every civil remedy available. For a second I just stood there in my little rental kitchen, sunlight on the cheap tile floor, basil plant leaning toward the window, and listened to the old refrigerator hum. Outside, a delivery truck backed into the alley, brakes squealing. Inside, all I could hear was my own pulse and the soft crackle of legal paper between my fingers. Then I turned to the second envelope already waiting on the counter. That one was mine. I had addressed it to Diane the night before and paid extra at the post office for certified delivery. Inside was a copy of the court notice setting a hearing date for the petition my attorney had filed that morning. Fraud. Harassment. Defamation. Financial abuse. A request for temporary restraints on further contact. A demand for preservation of documents. A subpoena list my lawyer said would make everyone suddenly remember how to tell the truth. Diane had mailed me a bill. I had mailed her a court date. If you have ever had someone hand you the cost of their own bad choices and expect you to pay it with a smile, then you already know the kind of woman Diane Mercer was. She believed paper made lies look respectable. She believed that if she typed a sentence on nice letterhead and signed it with a fountain pen, it became reality. For 12 years, that trick worked on waiters, church friends, contractors, scholarship boards, and most of all, on her son. It did not work on me. Not anymore. Before I tell you what happened when Diane signed for that envelope and realized what I had sent back, let me take you to the first night I ate dinner at the Mercer house, back when I still thought polished silverware meant polished character, back when Owen's smile could still blur the edges of my judgment, and back when Diane first looked at me across a candlelit table and measured exactly how useful I might be to her family. I met Owen Mercer on a Thursday in October at a fundraising event I hadn't wanted to attend. My friend Nadia worked for a community arts nonprofit and needed extra bodies and seats because half the donors on the invitation list had RSVP'd yes and then conveniently developed schedule conflicts. I wore a navy dress I'd found on clearance, spent 10 minutes trying to decide if my shoes looked cheap, and told myself I was only going because Nadia had once driven across town at 11 at night to help me move a bookcase that had collapsed in my apartment. Owen was at the silent auction table pretending to understand photography. He had one of those faces that cameras love because nothing on it seemed accidental. Clean jaw, warm brown eyes, hair that looked artfully disheveled even under ballroom lighting. He made room for me without looking impatient, read the bid sheet upside down, and whispered that one of the landscape photos looked like a dentist's office trying to feel spiritual. I laughed into my drink. He looked pleased with himself, but not in a way that felt mean. He asked what I did. I told him I was a staff accountant for a regional logistics company. He said that sounded intimidating, which was funny because in my experience accountant was the fastest way to drain glamour from a room. He said he worked in business development. That phrase would mean several different things over the years, each one less solid than the last, but that night it sounded broad and promising. He told stories easily. He listened well enough to seem interested. He walked me to my car and texted me before I got home. The first months with Owen were all velocity. Dinners, concerts in the park, long drives out past the suburbs where the roads narrowed and the sky looked bigger. He sent good morning texts with inside jokes. He remembered how I took my coffee. He touched the small of my back in crowded rooms with a tenderness that made me feel chosen. After a life of steady, practical, unromantic people, he felt like color after beige. And Diane adored me. At least, that was the performance. The Mercer house sat on a corner lot in a part of town where every lawn looked trimmed with nail scissors. Diane kept white hydrangeas along the walkway and changed the wreath on the front door with the seasons as if the neighborhood were taking attendance. The inside smelled like lemon polish and expensive candles. Nothing was out of place. Even the magazines on the coffee table were fanned with intention. She greeted me the first evening like I was already part of the family. Both hands around mine, bright smile, air kiss at my cheek. "So you're Lena," she said, like my name was a lovely answer to a question she'd been asking for years. "Owen has told us so much." That should have warned me. Owen did not tell people much. He gave people versions. His father, Victor, said less in an hour than Diane said in 30 seconds, but he had the worn, retreating look of a man who had spent years learning silence as a survival skill. His shoulders curved inward even while sitting at his own table. When Diane spoke, he looked down. When Owen spoke, Diane corrected him gently enough to sound loving. It was like watching a family stage play in which everyone had memorized the same script except me. Still, I was 28 and hopeful and in love with how it felt to be looked at by someone who seemed dazzled by me. I noticed things, yes. I noticed Diane asking what my salary range was under the sugar-coated cover of Financial Values. I noticed Owen glancing at her before answering certain questions, the way some men check weather before leaving the house. I noticed Victor's reflexive apology when he dropped a fork and Diane said, "Honestly, darling," in the same tone other people used for fire. But noticing is not the same as understanding. Back then, I still mistook control for competence. I still believed that people who kept immaculate dining rooms must also keep their moral lives in order. I was wrong. 2 months after we met, Owen took me to a little Italian place on a side street downtown where the tables were too close together and the red sauce stained everything it touched. He talked that night about expansion and timing and risk, the language of someone already drafting a future on the air in front of him. He wanted to leave corporate work, he said, and build something of his own. Consulting, maybe. Operations strategy. Brand partnerships. He had options, and while I could not have explained exactly what his current job was, I could explain exactly how he made ambition sound like intimacy. He spoke as if letting me hear his plans was itself a confession of trust. "You make me think long-term," he said, tracing the rim of his glass. "I've never had that before." It was manipulative, I can admit that now. Then, it felt like being invited into sunlight. When he proposed 9 months later, Diane cried before I did. She pressed a hand to her chest and said, "I knew it. The second I met you, I knew you were the one who would settle him. Not love him. Not understand him. Settle him." Even then the sentence landed wrong, though I smiled and let her take photos and immediately begin discussing venues. Diane moved through milestone moments like an event planner with emotional access. She chose champagne, florist options, linen samples, and whether our engagement photos should be taken somewhere timeless rather than trendy. Owen laughed and kissed my temple and said, "You know how she gets." What he meant was, surrender now, it's easier. My own family was smaller and messier and infinitely less polished. My father taught middle school history for 30 years and still drove a truck with one speaker blown out. My mother worked the front desk at a physical therapy clinic and believed there was no crisis that could not be improved by feeding people soup. They asked questions before giving opinions. They would have let us marry in a courthouse, backyard, or parking lot if it made us happy. The first time my mother met Diane, she brought a bundt cake wrapped in wax paper because she had been raised to arrive with something homemade. Diane accepted it with 2 fingers as if carbohydrates were contagious. My parents noticed more than I wanted them to. After one dinner, my dad helped me carry gifts to my car and said, carefully, "That family seems very interested in appearances." At the time I thought he was being unfair because plain people often distrust glossy ones. Now I understand he had seen the way Diane interrupted Victor, the way Owen deferred, the way every conversation circled status and performance and who was paying for what. The wedding became my first real education in how the Mercers operated. Nothing openly catastrophic happened. That was their genius. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no movie scenes dramatic enough to justify walking away. There were only 1,000 small rearrangements of reality until my own preferences began to feel childish and selfish next to Diane's experience. The garden venue I loved was too rustic. The simple dress I wanted looked unfinished. The local bakery my mother swore by was charming but inconsistent. Diane had opinions about invitations, music, guest list ratios, and whether my cousin's tattoos would look distracting in photos. Each objection arrived wrapped in concern. Each override came disguised as generosity. "Of course it's your day," she would say, already placing a deposit somewhere else. Owen's role in all this was not to agree with Diane exactly. It was subtler than that. He translated her control into reason. "She's just trying to help. She's paid for events before. This matters to her. It's easier if we let her handle details." He was always one step removed from the problem, which let him benefit from every concession while appearing innocent. The budget expanded. Diane insisted she would cover the overages because our side knows more people and these things do snowball. 3 weeks later she joked, in front of guests, that she deserved partial naming rights to our first child after funding the extravaganza. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. I'm embarrassed by how often women laugh while being warned. At the rehearsal dinner, Victor pulled me aside near the coat rack and said, in a low voice that smelled faintly of whiskey, "You seem strong. Don't let them confuse you." Before I could ask what he meant, Diane appeared like she had been listening through the walls and called him to the table. It was the only private thing he ever said to me, and for years I treated it like a loose thread I never dared tug. Marriage did not change Owen all at once. It clarified him. He was affectionate when life was easy, magnetic in public, and almost pathologically incapable of sitting with discomfort. If a bill was stressful, he put it in a drawer. If a client criticized him, he called the client short-sighted. If I raised a practical concern, he turned it into a referendum on whether I believed in him. The first year, I mistook that for insecurity. The second year, I recognized it as manipulation. By the third, I understood it was the architecture of his personality. He needed admiration like some people need insulin. Without it, everything in him destabilized. Diane fed that need constantly. She called him brilliant for half-finished plans, visionary for recycled ideas, mistreated for every consequence he invited. If a deal fell through, someone else had failed to recognize his gifts. If he missed a deadline, the timeline had been unreasonable. If he spent money he did not have, it was because winners invest in themselves. She narrated his life like he was a misunderstood prince trapped inside ordinary adulthood. And because I loved him, I kept trying to become the one person who could translate fantasy into structure. I paid off one of his credit cards after he swore it was temporary. I built spreadsheets for his consulting side work. I proofread proposals at midnight and woke early to make sure our rent cleared. When he talked about leaving his job to focus on a startup concept with 2 college friends, I did what I had always done with unstable things. I braced my body under them and hoped effort could substitute for integrity. If you have ever loved someone whose charm depends on someone else quietly absorbing the impact, then you know how exhausting hope can become. It looks noble from the outside. Up close, it is mostly unpaid labor and private fear. The first time Diane blamed me directly for one of Owen's failures, we had been married 14 months. He had pitched a logistics software partnership to a local retailer and spent 3 weeks boasting that the deal was basically done. Then the retailer passed. We learned later that Owen had overpromised deliverables his team could not support and had shown up late to the final review with the wrong version of the proposal. That night Diane called while I was washing dishes. I could hear her through the speaker before Owen even told me it was his mother. "You need to be more encouraging," she said. I stared at the sink full of suds. "I'm sorry?" He feels second-guessed at home. Men can sense that, Lena. It changes how they perform. I looked over at Owen, who did not defend me, did not even look embarrassed. He just rubbed his forehead and let her continue as if she were diagnosing weather patterns instead of insulting his wife. That was the first crack that did not smooth back over. By our second anniversary, the marriage had developed a rhythm that would have looked ordinary from the sidewalk. We had a condo with thin walls and decent light, a joint checking account, his coffee mugs in the sink and my work shoes lined by the door. We attended birthdays and weddings and one terrible 4th of July barbecue where Owen flirted shamelessly with a venture capitalist's daughter because, in his words later, networking is not cheating. We posted smiling photos at Christmas. We sent thank you cards. We knew which couple on our block fought loudly enough to draw curtains and felt smug that we were not them. But private damage rarely announces itself with noise. Most of ours collected quietly, in drawers and browser histories and the space between what Owen said and what I could verify. He changed jobs twice in 18 months, each move framed as strategic, each exit somehow another employer's fault. He launched a consulting website with stock photos of men in blue blazers pointing at tablets. He spent money on branding packages, headshots, client lunches, and a glass desk he said projected success. In the same month, he forgot our electric bill and borrowed $2,000 from our emergency savings to bridge cash flow. When I asked when he planned to replace it, he kissed my forehead and said, "You are always safest when you let me think big." That sentence sat in me like a stone. Diane's influence was everywhere. She did not need to be in the room. I could hear her in the language Owen used when he wanted to avoid accountability. Vision. Legacy. Support. Negativity. Men under pressure. Belief. Her vocabulary turned every practical boundary into betrayal. If I asked to review household finances before he signed on to something new, I was fearful. If I said no to another personal loan from my savings, I was transactional. If I objected to Diane dropping by unannounced with grocery bags and opinions, I was keeping family at arm's length. Once, after she let herself into our condo with the spare key Owen had given her without telling me, I came home from work and found her reorganizing my kitchen cabinets. "Your spices were in complete disarray," she said cheerfully, standing on a step stool in pearl earrings. I set my bag down very carefully. "Diane, you can't come in when I'm not home." Her smile thinned by less than an inch. "I'm family." That still doesn't make it okay. Owen arrived 10 minutes later and somehow made the entire scene about my tone. He said I had embarrassed his mother. He said she had been helping. He said my childhood made me overprotective about space, a sentence so patronizing I remember the exact way the late sunlight hit the wall behind him while he said it. After that, I changed the lock code. He gave her the new one within a week. Small invasions teach you what someone thinks your boundaries are worth. Then came the business. Owen had a friend from college named Travis who wore expensive sneakers and always smelled faintly of cologne and panic. Travis believed every city needed a boutique strategy lab, though neither he nor Owen could explain with precision what that meant. They brought in a third man named Reed whose primary talent was speaking confidently over other people. Together they formed Mercer West Advisory, a company that seemed to exist mostly as a deck, a logo, and a series of lunches with people too polite to leave. Owen wanted in at 1/3 ownership. He wanted seed capital, a better website, office space for credibility, and 6 months of runway. He presented the idea to me at our dining table like a teenager unveiling a science fair project and expecting a standing ovation. He had printed graphs. He had market projections. He had a list of near-certain clients. He also had no savings left of his own because he had burned through them in the previous 2 reinventions. How much are you asking from me? I said. From us, he corrected. How much? He named a number that made the room seem to tilt. $40,000. It was more than half of what I had inherited from my grandmother, money I had kept in a separate account because she had spent her whole life saving in 20s and 50s from overtime shifts and church bake sales and years of never buying herself anything unnecessary. She used to joke that the money was not large enough to change my life, only large enough to protect me from having to beg. It was the most practical gift anyone had ever given me. I said no immediately. Owen went silent in a way I had learned to fear more than anger. Quiet for him was not reflection. It was theater. It was the part where he waited for me to feel cruel. He pushed the printed deck toward me and said, "If you can't invest in your husband, just say that. I can support you without handing over my grandmother's money." "Why keep calling it your grandmother's money?" he snapped. "You're married. We're building a future." I almost said, "We are only building anything because I keep carrying the lumber." Instead I said I would consider a smaller amount with legal paperwork, full accounting, and no access to the rest. He stood up so fast the chair scraped tile. "You want contracts between spouses now?" "No," I said. "I want clarity between adults." He left, and 40 minutes later Diane called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail anyway. "I'm disappointed, Lena. Really disappointed. Men know when their wives don't believe in them. Don't be the reason he learns not to dream." That was Diane's talent. She could take a woman's caution and recast it as violence. I wish I could say that was the moment I saw everything clearly, but seeing clearly is easier in retrospect than in real time. In real time, I was tired. I was working full days, cleaning up small financial fires at home, and carrying the shame that women are taught to carry when their marriages do not feel loving enough. I still believed hard conversations could save us if I timed them well. I still thought facts could outlast performance. So I did what practical women too often do when surrounded by charming irresponsibility. I compromised. I agreed to lend Owen $10,000 with a notarized agreement stating repayment terms and explicitly limiting the funds to that amount. He acted wounded by the paperwork but signed it. Diane called it insulting. Travis called it unnecessarily corporate. Reed joked that I was the first spouse in history to turn love into underwriting. 3 months later, Owen had missed the first repayment date and wanted me to stop tracking this like an accounts receivable problem. The company had no stable clients. The office space they leased was more expensive than promised. Reed disappeared for a week with a company card. Travis blamed branding. Owen blamed market conditions. Diane blamed me. "You made him feel managed from day one," she said one Sunday after church brunch, slicing smoked salmon with surgical calm. "Nobody thrives under suspicion." I looked at her linen tablecloth, the silver butter knife, the crystal juice glasses catching the light. Her world was always immaculate enough to disguise the rot underneath. Mine had become a set of spreadsheets nobody wanted to read. That afternoon, for the first time, I started saving copies. Bank statements. Text messages. Loan documents. Voicemails. Emails. I created a private folder on an old external drive and named it tax receipts because Owen never opened anything that sounded boring. I didn't know then how much I would need it. The first document that truly frightened me was not dramatic. It was a utility notice. A final warning from our internet provider, bright red banner across the top, threatening service interruption for non-payment. I found it tucked under a stack of unopened mail inside the hall drawer where Owen dropped anything inconvenient. The amount was not large. The problem was that I had already transferred money for it 2 weeks earlier. I went online, checked our joint account, and saw the payment had never posted because the balance had dipped below the threshold overnight after a series of charges I didn't recognize. There were 3 restaurant charges, a rideshare bill from another city, 2 subscription renewals Owen had sworn he cancelled, and a transfer labeled simply WM Holdings. I stared at that last line for a long time. When Owen came home, cheerful and windblown and full of some new story about a potential client, I asked him what WM Holdings was. He blinked once. Working capital thing. That's not an answer. It's an account Travis uses. For what? He shrugged and loosened his tie. Receivables, expenses, whatever. Why are you interrogating me at the door? Because our internet is about to be shut off and money I transferred for bills is disappearing into accounts you haven't explained. He exhaled sharply, already irritated, already preparing his pivot. I swear, Lena, the minute there's pressure you turn into an auditor, not a wife. That would have worked on me once. That night it didn't. I asked for access to the business records. He refused on principle first, then on privacy grounds, then finally because the books are complicated. I remember feeling something cold and clean settle into place inside me. Fear, yes, but also a kind of alignment. Honest people don't hide ordinary records from the spouse whose income is keeping the lights on. The next week, I stayed late at work and asked a senior analyst I trusted how difficult it would be, in theory, to identify whether personal expenses were moving through a small private company. I kept names out of it. He kept his face neutral and said, also in theory, that people doing messy things usually underestimate how visible patterns become if you know where to look. Patterns. That was a word I understood. I started with what I already had. Transfers from our account. Copies of the loan agreement. Credit card statements. Calendar history. Emails Owen left open on our shared tablet when he was careless. The picture formed slowly, then all at once. Mercer West Advisory was bleeding money. The company card covered dinners that were not client dinners, hotel charges attached to no travel itinerary, luxury clothing purchases Owen claimed were for investor meetings, and recurring payments to a storage unit in Diane's neighborhood. WM Holdings was not a receivables account. It was an LLC Diane had formed 11 years earlier for property management, though as far as I could tell it managed nothing except moving family money around with formal labels. More alarming were the signatures. Owen had electronically signed my name on 2 documents tied to a line of credit application for the business. One was an acknowledgement of spousal consent. The other was a financial disclosure that attached our household assets to a guarantee structure I had never seen. My signature was not scanned from anything I had signed. It was recreated badly, the L and Lena too tall, the final loop cramped. A stranger might not have noticed. I did immediately, because those are the little ways women recognize when someone has entered their life without permission. I felt physically sick. I printed everything at the office the next morning rather than using our home printer. My hand shook so hard I had to refeed one stack because I loaded it crooked. I told my manager I might need a personal day later in the week. Then I sat in my car during lunch and called an attorney whose name Nadia had given me 2 years earlier after her sister's divorce. Her receptionist offered a consultation the following Tuesday. I did not confront Owen yet. People say that if you catch betrayal, you should lay it all out at once and demand answers. Maybe that works when the person across from you still experiences shame. Owen experienced inconvenience. Diane experienced offense. Truth, for them, was not a boundary. It was a negotiating position. So I went quiet. Not cold. Not suspicious enough to trigger a scramble. Quiet enough to observe. At home, Owen talked more when he thought I believed him. He mentioned a cash flow crunch but said a large contract was imminent. He complained that Travis had spooked an investor. He said Reed had bad instincts. He asked if I could float another $5,000 just for 2 weeks. I told him year-end accounting at work had me mentally stretched and I wanted to revisit finances after the month closed. He accepted that because it sounded boring. Diane, meanwhile, began showing up with increasing frequency under the banner of concern. She brought baked ziti, vitamin supplements, articles about entrepreneurial marriage, and once a framed print for our living room that said great things are built by families who believe. I put it in the coat closet while she was in the bathroom. She also started asking pointed questions. Was I sleeping enough? Did I think stress from my job made me less emotionally available? Did I understand how much pressure Owen was under? Had I considered that some wives focus so much on safety they end up shrinking their husbands? She never accused outright at first. She accumulated implication. That is how skilled manipulators work. They don't drop a weight on your chest immediately. They pile napkins there until you wonder why you can't breathe. One Friday evening, she invited us to dinner and used the salad course to bring up a condo in her friend's building that had just gone on the market below value. Owen looked confused. I knew why. We were not shopping for property. Diane dabbed her mouth and said, almost casually, a smarter neighborhood might create the right environment for Owen's clients. With what money? I asked. Victor's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Diane smiled. Well, families solve these things creatively. Owen stared at his plate. I looked from one face to the other and understood, suddenly, that conversations had been happening without me. Plans. Expectations. Maybe fantasies. But some version of my income, my credit, my inheritance, or my labor had already been mentally assigned to their next move. I said, my finances are not a family resource pool. No one spoke for 3 full seconds. Then Diane laughed, light and brittle. My goodness, no one said they were. But Owen would not meet my eyes, and Victor looked like a man hearing a train he could not stop. That night, after Owen fell asleep, I checked the shared cloud folder on our laptop. He had grown sloppy again. Under a subfolder labeled Projections, I found draft budget sheets for a potential condo purchase. The down payment line was highlighted yellow. Beside it, in Diane's unmistakable comment font, was written, Lena reserve funds if positioned correctly. I read it 3 times. Reserve funds. If positioned correctly. I sat in the dark with the screen glow on my hands and understood that to this family I was not a person at the table. I was liquidity with a pulse. The consultation with the attorney stopped being precaution and became preparation. Marisol Vega's office was on the 4th floor of an older brick building downtown above a tailor and across from a bakery that sold almond croissants the size of plates. I remember that detail because the world felt offensively normal that morning. People waited at crosswalks. A woman in green scrubs laughed into her phone. A man walked a golden retriever past the parking meter where I fed quarters with fingers that would not stay steady. Meanwhile my marriage, as I understood it, had already tipped over and was falling. Marisol did not waste time performing sympathy. I loved her instantly for that. She read quickly, asked sharper questions than I was ready for, and never once told me to calm down. She wanted timelines, account access, who had passwords, whether my signature had been notarized on anything, whether there had been threats, whether I felt physically unsafe, whether my inheritance had ever been commingled, whether Diane had money of her own, whether Victor knew more than he pretended, whether I had copies of tax filings. When I mentioned the forged documents, her expression changed by half a degree. That's not just marital dishonesty, she said. That's potentially actionable fraud. The word landed like metal. I had come in prepared to hear hard things. I was not prepared for how validating hard things could feel when spoken plainly. Fraud was a better word than misunderstanding. Harassment was a better word than over-involvement. Coercive control was a better phrase than difficult family dynamics. The truth did not become uglier in legal language. It became visible. Marisol told me not to confront anyone yet. She gave me a list. Freeze my credit. Open a new account at a different bank. Redirect my paycheck. Remove sentimental or irreplaceable items from the condo before any announcement. Photograph every room. Back up every device I legally could. Download statements before access changed. Do not tip off Owen or Diane by suddenly sounding stronger than usual. People who believe you are trapped act differently once they realize you are not. Predators panic when leverage disappears, she said. That sentence followed me for weeks. I spent the next 11 days building my exit with the same quiet diligence I had once wasted trying to build Owen's ambitions. It is astonishing how much energy appears when survival finally has a direction. Nadia helped me move essentials into her guest room, one trash bag at a time. Work clothes. Grandmother's jewelry box. Passport. External drive. Medical records. The little brass lamp from my first apartment. The hand-thrown cereal bowl my mother had made in a community pottery class and given me because she was proud the glaze turned out blue instead of mud brown. Things that did not matter to Owen but mattered to me. Proof of a self that existed before the Mercers began narrating me as a support structure. At home, Owen was increasingly erratic. Some nights he came in buoyant with exaggerated confidence, full of names and momentum and game-changing calls. Other nights he paced until 2 a.m, muttering about people wasting his time. He started drinking more, though not enough that anyone at church or brunch would label it a problem. Diane called constantly. If he silenced her, she texted. If he didn't answer within 10 minutes, she called me instead and asked where he was. Victor, oddly, started lingering after those dinners that still somehow kept happening while I prepared to leave. He would carry plates to the sink despite Diane's irritation and ask me small questions in a voice that suggested larger ones underneath. How was work? Was my mother recovering well from knee surgery? Did I still read as much as I used to? It took me too long to realize he was trying, in the only way he knew, to communicate that he saw the ground moving under us. Then there was the storage unit. One of the charges on the company card had included a location number. During a long lunch break, I drove past the facility. I had no access, no legal right to enter, but I wanted to see whether it even existed. It did. Beige buildings, keypad gate, sun-faded security signs. From the parking lot I watched Diane's SUV pull up 10 minutes later. She punched in a code with the ease of routine. My heart slammed so hard it hurt. I waited until she drove away, then took photos of the entry sign, the unit row, her license plate leaving the lot. I might have driven off with only that if she had not made one mistake. In her rush, she left the unit door half-latched instead of locked. The gap was only an inch. But through that inch I could see stacked banker boxes and, on top of one, a familiar dark green fireproof folder I had last seen in our condo office cabinet. I called Marisol from my car. She told me not to touch the unit, not to give anyone an opening to accuse me of trespass. She also told me the discovery mattered, especially if business or household records had been moved offsite in anticipation of conflict. That same week, Owen asked me to sign updated tax documentation for the company's lenders. The packet was clipped neatly, pages flagged where he wanted signatures. He had chosen a Tuesday night after bringing home sushi and flowers, which would have been laughably transparent if I hadn't once called such efforts romance. I read the first page, then the third, then the attached schedule. My name appeared beside asset listings that included the remainder of my inheritance and a money market account I had never authorized as collateral. The signature lines at the end were blank, waiting for my ignorance. I set the packet down. Owen, I said, why is my separate account listed on this? He leaned against the counter as if I were being tiresome. Because they want a full household picture. It doesn't mean they're taking anything. That's not what this language says. Lena, it's standard. No, it isn't. He exhaled, slow and performative. You always do this. Every time there's an opportunity, you go hunting for danger. I looked at him and, for the first time, felt more clarity than grief. Opportunity. Danger. He still believed those were subjective categories. He still believed confidence could overwrite text. I slid the packet back across the counter. I'm not signing anything tonight. He stared for a beat too long. Then his whole face shifted, not into rage but into something thinner and meaner. Contempt, maybe. Or just the fatigue of a man realizing a trick he expected to work no longer would. Fine, he said. Be difficult. It was the last document he ever asked me to sign in person. 3 mornings later, after he left for a meeting and before Diane could launch her daily weather system of calls, I moved out. I took my clothes, my documents, my grandmother's quilt, and the blue bowl. I left the wedding album. By noon, Owen had called 16 times. By 2, Diane had left me my first truly vicious voicemail. "How dare you humiliate my son like this," she hissed. "After everything this family has done for you." Everything, in Diane's world, always meant whatever debt she hoped to invent next. The first 48 hours after I left taught me exactly how much of the Mercer family's stability depended on my availability. Owen's messages cycled fast. Pleading, confusion, charm, anger, injury, legal-sounding nonsense, sudden tenderness, accusations, then back again. He said he deserved a conversation. He said I was overreacting. He said he had been under extraordinary pressure. He said I was letting outsiders poison my mind. He said he missed me. He said I was selfish. He said Diane was beside herself. He said we could fix this privately if I stopped acting like an enemy. Privately, in Mercer language, meant without witnesses. I did not respond except through Marisol. The moment he learned I had retained counsel, his tone changed. It didn't become honest. It became strategic. He began referring to miscommunications, shared misunderstandings, and temporary cash strains. Diane, on the other hand, dropped all pretense of diplomacy. She left voicemails so acidic I started forwarding them to Marisol before listening all the way through. One accused me of stealing business materials, though every item I had removed was mine. One accused me of sabotaging Owen's reputation by creating hysteria. One contained a prayer request she claimed she was tempted to share with church leadership unless I stopped escalating. One was just breathing, a long silent message with a television playing faintly in the background. That one disturbed me most because it felt intentional in a way rage sometimes doesn't. Then came the package. It arrived 12 days after I moved out, sent to Nadia's townhouse because someone at the condo building had apparently told Diane where my mail had been redirected. The cream envelope, the heavy paper, the impossible bill. By then Marisol had already filed for legal separation, sought temporary financial restraints, and requested expedited discovery related to the forged credit documents. We were waiting on hearing dates and document preservation orders. Diane did not know exactly what had been filed yet. She only knew that control was slipping. The bill was her answer to that feeling. I sat at Nadia's kitchen table and read every line out loud because some forms of absurdity need witnesses. She choked on her tea when I got to family reputation damage. "Oh, absolutely invoice her for your suffering while you're at it," she said. "Add line items for listening to Diane say the word legacy." I laughed, but underneath the laughter was a deep, cooling anger. Not hot anger. Hot anger burns fast. This was the kind that clarifies choices. The bill included a typed cover letter claiming that I had caused Owen measurable vocational loss by withdrawing emotional and financial support at a critical stage in his career. Diane cited the engagement dinner, holiday gifts, a 6-week period after our honeymoon when Owen briefly stayed at her house while finding his direction, and money she claimed the family had spent stabilizing our marriage. She enclosed copies of Zelle transfers she had made to Owen over the years as if parental enabling could become a marital debt recoverable from the wife who finally left. At the bottom she added a sentence in her own handwriting, "A good woman repairs what she breaks." That line did something to me. Because it explained her whole worldview in 9 words. A good woman, to Diane, was a repair service for male failure. A wife was insulation. A daughter-in-law was an extension cord. If a son lied, overpromised, forged, borrowed, stalled, drank, blamed, or collapsed, the nearest woman's job was to absorb the damage discreetly enough that his future remained intact. If she refused, she became the vandal. I folded the pages back along their original creases and called Marisol. She was silent for a moment after I read the letter aloud. "Do not respond emotionally," she said. "Respond elegantly." That is how the court notice mailing happened. Marisol had already expected the hearing date within the week because the judge assigned to temporary relief motions moved quickly when financial irregularities and harassment overlapped. The notice arrived by email the next morning. She filed supplemental exhibits that afternoon: the bill, Diane's voicemails, proof of the forged documents, screenshots of the condo budget comments using my reserve funds, and our request that all parties be ordered to preserve electronic communications and business records pending discovery. Then she asked if I wanted Diane formally served by a process server or whether I preferred to send the courtesy copy myself. I looked at the bill on my table and said, I want her signature on receipt. So I mailed it certified. There was one more thing we did that week that changed the entire case. Victor called me. He had never phoned me directly in all the years I had known him. When his name appeared on my screen, I nearly didn't answer because I assumed it was Diane using his phone. But then I heard his voice, low and tired and carefully separated from background noise, and I knew it was really him. I can't talk long, he said. She checks the itemized bill. Even then, with everything crashing, that phrasing almost made me smile. The man was so shaped by surveillance that he narrated his own wife like weather conditions. I stepped into Nadia's backyard and listened. Victor did not become a hero that day. I need to be fair about that. He did not confess to everything or apologize for all the years he had let Diane steamroll the world. But he gave me 3 pieces of information that mattered. First, Diane had been holding company records, bank correspondence, and signed copies of Owen's lender packets in the storage unit because she believed wives snoop and employees leak. Second, Owen had used my name in conversations with lenders far more aggressively than I knew, implying access to separate funds and positioning me as a guarantor in waiting. Third, Diane had told at least 2 relatives and 1 church elder that I was emotionally unstable, financially vindictive, and trying to bleed Owen dry in anticipation of divorce. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally he said, because he is becoming her. That might have been too little. It might have come years too late. But it was true, and truth, even delayed, can still matter. Marisol nearly vibrated with focus when I relayed the call. We subpoenaed the storage facility records. We amended our filing to include emerging evidence of defamatory statements. And for the first time since leaving, I felt something close to steadiness. Not because the fight would be easy. It wouldn't. But because the fog had thinned enough for me to see the shape of the ground beneath it. 3 days later, Diane signed for my envelope at 10:14 a.m. At 10:31, my phone exploded. The first voicemail Diane left after signing for the court notice was too furious to be coherent. There was a sharp intake of breath, the scrape of what sounded like a chair, and then her voice coming in hot and high. "You vindictive little fraud," she snapped. "How dare you drag this family into court over your own spite? Do you really think a judge is going to reward this behavior?" Then a click, as if she had hung up by accident or restraint had arrived 1 second too late. The second message, 12 minutes later, was calmer in the way dangerous people become calm when they remember they are trying to look reasonable for an imagined audience. "I think you're making a terrible mistake," she said. "Once things are filed publicly, there is no taking them back. Reputations are fragile. Employment is fragile. Church relationships are fragile. Be very careful what you force us to defend." Marisol listened to both and smiled without humor. "Good," she said. "Threats wearing pearls are still threats." From then on, everything accelerated. Owen's attorney appeared within 48 hours, a smooth man named Kenneth Brill who wrote 6-page letters to avoid admitting simple facts. He denied forgery to the extent any signature irregularity can be characterized that way. He characterized the use of my financial information as ordinary spousal disclosure in support of entrepreneurial financing. He suggested I had abandoned the marital residence in a destabilizing manner and implied my work in accounting gave me an unusual appetite for control over shared resources. It was the kind of language designed to make male carelessness sound visionary and female caution sound pathological. Marisol answered with exhibits. She attached the notarized loan agreement Owen had already breached, the lender packet with my forged e-signature, screenshots of Diane's comments about my reserve funds, recordings of the voicemails, the absurd demand letter, and a timeline demonstrating that substantial family money movements had occurred through Diane's LLC after I refused further funding. She also included a line that I still remember because it felt like a flare shot into the sky: petitioner does not seek to control respondents' resources. She seeks only to prevent further unlawful attempts to control hers. That sentence steadied me for days. Discovery turned the Mercer family into exactly what they feared most: a source of documents. Subpoenas went to the storage facility, 2 banks, Mercer West Advisory, WM Holdings, and the lender involved in the fraudulent credit application. A church elder received notice because Diane had used him as a character witness in a letter before we added the defamation claim, apparently assuming clergy involvement would scare me into silence. It did the opposite. If my name had been carried into rooms I was not in, then I wanted the doors opened. And because Diane believed appearances could still save her, she started campaigning. She called my mother first. My mother told me later Diane began in a syrup tone, saying she hated conflict and simply wanted the girls to sit down. Within 2 minutes she was accusing me of sabotaging Owen's livelihood and breaking sacred family bonds over mere paperwork misunderstandings. My mother let her talk until the word sacred appeared, then said, "A forged signature is not a misunderstanding, Diane," and hung up. I was absurdly proud. Next Diane tried church. She asked if I would meet privately with a pastoral counselor to discuss reconciliation. Owen sent a text saying litigation was poisoning any chance at grace. Grace, in that context, meant immunity. Then came social pressure. 2 of Owen's cousins unfollowed me, which I noticed only because one of them had once borrowed a bridesmaid dress from me and returned it with wine on the hem. A family friend sent a message that began, "I'm sure there are 2 sides." That phrase has always fascinated me. People say it most often when they hope one side will sit down and stop making the other side uncomfortable. Nadia wanted to answer everyone with screenshots. Marisol said no. Let the filing speak. In private, I kept doing the least glamorous, most important work, documenting every call log, every forwarded message, every new discovery response. When the bank records from WM Holdings arrived, Marisol had her forensic consultant review them. By the end of that week we knew that Diane's LLC had served as a holding account for multiple transfers that originated from either Owen's business or loans obtained on the strength of representations about marital assets. We also found reimbursement notes attached to several outgoing payments from Diane to Owen labeled bridge support pending Lena access. Pending Lena access. Even written, they still thought of me as a door. The storage unit records were worse for them. Photographs taken during an insurance inventory 2 months earlier showed box labels in Diane's handwriting, lender packets, tax backup, Owen personal, condo docs, and one simply marked Lena. That last one made my skin crawl. Not because I thought she had collected anything mystical, but because it revealed the mindset. My name was not a relationship. It was a file category. We filed a motion to compel immediate turnover of all documents bearing my financial information. The hearing date remained 3 weeks away, but the pressure was already changing the air around everyone. Owen began to crack first. He requested, through counsel, an off-the-record meeting to clear up confusion. Marisol refused unless counsel was present and the conversation recorded for settlement purposes. He withdrew the request. 2 nights later he sent me a direct text anyway, against advice I am sure he had been given. I never wanted it to go this far. That line might have moved me once. Now all I could think was, because you assumed I would stop first. I did not answer. The second crack came from Mercer West Advisory itself. Travis, either spooked by subpoenas or loyal only to self-preservation, retained separate counsel and began cooperating in exchange for distancing himself from the more fraudulent representations. Reed vanished into the mist of his own bad decisions and sent an email blaming founder stress. Translation: Run. The third crack came from Victor. He left Diane. Not in a cinematic way. No suitcase on a lawn, no speech. He rented a furnished apartment 3 neighborhoods over and informed Owen by email that he would not participate in further concealment. Diane responded with a 13-message barrage that somehow mixed fury, scripture, and meal planning. He forwarded all of it to Marisol voluntarily. By then even I could see the ending beginning to shape itself, not because justice arrives neatly, but because lies require coordination and panic ruins coordination. Still, I knew better than to feel victorious too early. Diane had spent her entire life weaponizing confidence. People like that do not collapse once. They lunge on the way down. The lunge came on a rainy Tuesday, 8 days before the hearing, when she posted a long statement on social media about false allegations and women who exploit legal systems to punish good men. Marisol printed it in color. Court hearings in movies are all surprise objections and dramatic witnesses appearing at the back of the room. Real ones are fluorescent and procedural and full of people carrying folders from one beige hallway to another. The first time I walked into family court for our temporary motions hearing, I was struck by how ordinary the building felt. Scuffed chairs. Coffee from a vending machine. A security guard reminding someone to empty their pockets. Justice, when it begins, often looks less like thunder and more like waiting under bad lighting with your whole life paperclipped in front of a stranger. I wore charcoal gray and low heels. Marisol carried 2 binders and a calm expression I had come to treat as oxygen. Owen was already there with Kenneth Brill, posture rigid, jaw dark with a rushed shave. He looked older, not wiser. Diane sat 1 row back in a cream blazer, lips pressed into a line so precise it seemed drawn on with a ruler. She had chosen pearls, which made sense. Diane always dressed for the role she wanted the room to assign her, respectable woman under attack. When she saw me, she smiled. That smile told me she still believed presentation could outrun evidence. The hearing covered temporary financial restraints, use of marital funds, non-harassment provisions, and preservation of documents. It was not yet the full fraud trial. But it was the first time a judge would hear, in structured form, the outline of what they had done. Kenneth argued first. He framed me as a departing spouse with a grudge, a financially sophisticated woman attempting to criminalize imperfect business practices after losing faith in her husband's entrepreneurial path. He downplayed the forged signatures as auto-population anomalies common in digital document platforms. He characterized Diane's bill as an intemperate personal communication from a distraught mother, not evidence of a campaign. He suggested I was overreading family comments because litigation rewarded paranoia. Marisol stood and dismantled him with the patience of a woman slicing thread. She began with the signature comparison, enlarged and side by side. Then the loan agreement Owen had signed acknowledging my separate funds were not part of his business capitalization. Then the lender packet listing those same funds as available collateral. Then the comments in the condo budget referencing Lena reserve funds if positioned correctly. Then the voicemail where Diane threatened reputational harm after being served. Then the social post. Then bank transfer annotations from WM Holdings. Then the storage unit inventory labels. Then Victor's declaration, short and devastating, stating he had personal knowledge of Diane and Owen planning to access my funds without my informed consent. Diane's face shifted incrementally with each exhibit, like a woman realizing the room had been recording her for years. The judge, a silver-haired woman with a tired but attentive expression, asked Owen directly whether he had permission to represent my separate assets as available in credit materials. Kenneth started to answer for him. The judge cut him off. I asked your client. Owen swallowed. I believed, as her spouse, that we had a shared future and shared resources. It was the wrong answer. Belief is not authorization. Hope is not consent. Marriage is not a blank signature line. The judge's tone sharpened. She asked whether I had signed the packet. Owen said not physically. She asked whether he had uploaded a digital signature purporting to be mine. He said he had completed the package under time pressure. Kenneth looked like he wanted to evaporate. Then came Diane. Marisol had not expected testimony from her that day, but Kenneth, perhaps thinking a polished older woman could neutralize the optics, called her anyway on the harassment issue. It was the fatal mistake. Under direct examination, Diane sounded wounded, dignified, maternal. She said she had supported the marriage emotionally and financially. She said she feared for her son's mental health after I left abruptly. She said her letter was a foolish expression of heartbreak, not a demand she expected me to take literally. Then Marisol stood for cross. I have never seen anyone lose altitude so fast without leaving the ground. Marisol asked whether Diane formed WM Holdings. Yes. Whether she stored Mercer West records in a unit under her control. Yes, for safekeeping. Whether she had ever discussed my inheritance, savings, or credit profile in relation to Owen's business prospects. Only generally. Whether the phrase pending Lena access appeared in her account notes. She didn't recall. Whether she had written Lena reserve funds if positioned correctly in the condo budget file. Diane tried to say it was a joke. Marisol held up the enlarged screenshot. No laughing notation appears, Ms. Mercer. What exactly was the joke? Diane said nothing. Marisol moved to the bill. She asked whether Diane had demanded money for family reputation damage. Diane said she was emotional. She asked whether Diane had included a 30-day deadline and threat of civil remedies. Diane said it was not formal litigation language. She asked whether Diane had contacted my mother, church leadership, and other third parties to discuss my alleged instability. Diane said she had sought support in a painful time. Then Marisol played the voicemail. Threats sound uglier in public than they do in your own kitchen. The room listened while Diane's recorded voice warned me that reputations and employment were fragile and I should be careful what I forced them to defend. When it ended, even Kenneth stared at the table. The judge issued temporary orders from the bench. No party was to transfer, encumber, hide, destroy, or alter financial records. Owen was barred from using or representing any asset held solely in my name. Diane was ordered to cease direct contact and not publish or disseminate statements about me related to the litigation. The storage facility contents were to be preserved and made available for supervised inspection. The judge also referred the signature issue for further evidentiary review at the next stage and set an aggressive schedule because, as she put it, the paperwork in this matter is more adventurous than the court appreciates. It was not the final win. But it was the first time authority larger than Diane's dining room had told her no. Outside the courtroom, she tried to walk past me with her chin high. Then she stopped, turned, and said in a voice that trembled with hate, "You have no idea what you've done to this family." I met her gaze. For years, I had feared this exact kind of confrontation. I had rehearsed speeches, explanations, softer versions of truth. What came out instead was simple and clean. No, Diane. I know exactly what your family tried to do to me. Marisol touched my elbow and guided me away before Diane could answer. If you have ever waited years for one honest sentence to find you at the right moment, then you know how quiet power can sound. It does not always arrive loud. Sometimes it arrives after fluorescent hearings and bad coffee, on courthouse tile, in a voice you finally recognize as your own. The full evidentiary hearing was set for 6 weeks later. That was when everything really came apart. The 6 weeks between the temporary orders hearing and the full evidentiary hearing were the longest and clearest of my adult life. Once the immediate panic passed, the Mercer family had to do something they had spent years avoiding: live inside facts. Facts are slow. Facts don't flatter. Facts don't care who hosted the nicest Christmas Eve dinner or who cried the prettiest at church. Facts sit in columns and timestamps and metadata and signatures and banknotes and backup drives. Facts are humble little things right until they wreck a lie. The supervised inspection of the storage unit alone gave Marisol enough material to build a wall. Inside Diane's banker boxes were printouts of lender communications, duplicate copies of packets Owen claimed were merely drafts, handwritten notes about timing the ask, and a legal pad where Diane had outlined, in bullet points, how to reframe Lena resistance as fear-based rather than disloyal. She had literally written the script she used on me, right there in blue ink between reminders about dry cleaning and a brunch reservation. There were also copies of my pay stubs, a photocopy of my driver's license, beneficiary forms from an old retirement account, and an envelope containing passwords in Owen's handwriting. Some documents he had no right to remove from our condo office. Others I had never knowingly shared with either of them. Seeing my life reduced to a folder under my first name should have felt violating, and it did. But it also felt clarifying. They had not misunderstood me. They had studied me. Travis settled early. In exchange for cooperation and indemnity arguments against Owen and Diane, he provided email chains showing that both had urged him to describe me to lenders as conservative but on board once structured. Translation: lie now, pressure later. He also produced a text from Owen sent at 1:12 a.m. one night after a rejected loan inquiry. Mom thinks we can get there if Lena stops acting like the money dies with her. That line haunted me less for its cruelty than for its entitlement. The money dies with her. As if my grandmother's savings, my own labor, my own legal identity were an inconvenience to male potential. Victor, once he started, gave more than I expected. Not because he became brave all at once, but because separation from Diane seemed to return oxygen to him. In his declaration and later deposition, he admitted he had heard Diane instruct Owen to complete what needs completing on document packets before asking me to sign, because women panic less after the train is already moving. He admitted Diane had referred to my inheritance as the only solid asset in reach. He admitted he had stayed quiet for years because opposing Diane felt useless. That confession did not redeem him, but it mattered. Sometimes truth from a coward still helps the trapped. Owen never adjusted well to evidence. He looked better in ambiguity. Each filing made him sloppier. In his interrogatory responses he contradicted earlier positions. He claimed the business had never truly relied on my assets, then complained in the next paragraph that my refusal to support his ventures had caused avoidable collapse. He denied knowledge of Diane's bill, then referred to it as understandable maternal frustration. He said the signature irregularity was technological, then later called it ministerial completion. Every version preserved one central belief: he should not have to pay for using people up if he had done it with enough confidence. By the time the final hearing arrived, my fear had changed shape. I was no longer afraid they would win the facts. I was afraid only of reliving them aloud. But even that fear had softened around the edges because my life, outside the case, had begun to reassemble itself. I found a small apartment with good morning light and uneven wood floors. I bought a second-hand dining table that wobbled until Nadia fixed it with folded cardboard under one leg. I painted the bedroom a soft clay color and put my grandmother's quilt at the foot of the bed. At work, I accepted a promotion I had hesitated to pursue when married because Owen had once said my corporate ladder energy made him feel judged. Imagine that. A woman doing her job competently, and somewhere a mediocre man experiences weather. I took the promotion anyway. The final hearing lasted most of the day. Marisol presented cleanly, methodically, and with almost offensive restraint. She did not need theatrics. She had records. The bank trail showed funds moving through accounts in ways inconsistent with ordinary family support. The forged signature packet was authenticated by platform metadata and compared against known samples. The storage unit materials demonstrated intentional collection and off-site retention of my financial information. Diane's own notes and correspondence illustrated planning language, narrative coaching, and retaliatory intent once I resisted. The bill she sent me became, in context, not merely outrageous but evidentiary, proof that she believed my refusal to subsidize Owen created a debt she could formalize through shame. When it was my turn to testify, I told the truth in the least glamorous way possible. I described the marriage, the loans, the signatures, the pressure, the comments, the lock code, the budget file. The moment I realized I was not a partner in their eyes but an account waiting to be positioned correctly. I did not cry until I mentioned my grandmother's inheritance and how carefully she had saved it. Even then the tears embarrassed me because by that point I was not crying from weakness. I was crying because for years I had been made to feel selfish for protecting what a woman before me had built with blistered hands. Kenneth tried to rattle me on cross. He suggested I had always looked down on Owen's ambition. I said no, I had funded it. He suggested I used legal process to punish a disappointing husband. I said no, I used it to stop ongoing misuse of my identity and assets. He suggested families often blur lines. I said blurred lines do not generate typed bills and false signatures by themselves. The judge ruled from the bench later that afternoon and supplemented it in writing 2 days after, but I remember the bones of it clearly. The court found that Owen had improperly represented my separate assets in credit-related materials without informed consent, that he had participated in the unauthorized application of my signature in at least one lender packet, and that his conduct justified financial restraints, fee shifting, and referral of relevant records for further review by appropriate authorities. The court found Diane had engaged in harassment and retaliatory communication, had knowingly inserted herself into the misuse of my financial information, and had attempted to pressure me through a baseless demand styled as an invoice. Both were ordered to cease defamatory publication. Certain funds were frozen pending unwind and accounting. My attorney's fees were assessed largely against Owen, with contribution findings tied to Diane's conduct in later enforcement. Owen looked stunned, then angry, then blank. Diane looked offended. That, more than anything, told me who she was. Even then, even after documents and testimony and judicial findings, she did not look ashamed. She looked inconvenienced by a world that had temporarily refused to obey her. Outside, reporters were not waiting. No dramatic crowd applauded. The sky threatened rain. Nadia hugged me so hard my earrings hurt. Marisol checked 3 emails before I finished thanking her. Real victories are often like that. Quiet. Administrative. Life-changing without soundtrack. 3 months later, the rest settled in sequence. Mercer West dissolved. One lender pursued Owen separately. Church people discovered, as they always do, that gossip feels holier before records surface than after. Victor filed for divorce from Diane. Owen moved into a furnished corporate apartment paid for by an uncle who had once called me steady as if steadiness were a cute hobby. Diane stopped mailing letters. And me? I stopped apologizing for not being a bridge over someone else's collapse. The last thing I ever sent Diane Mercer was not an insult, not a warning, not even a legal notice. It was a short reimbursement receipt through counsel showing the amount she and her son had been ordered to cover toward my fees. Paid in full, weeks later, by certified funds. I kept a copy in a drawer, not because I needed proof anymore, but because sometimes justice is not a speech. Sometimes it is a paper trail ending exactly where manipulation thought it would begin.